Hey, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Noel Healy, and I'm a professor in the Geography and Sustainability Department here at Salem State University. I organized today's webinar as part of one of my classes I teach here called Saving the World. I'd first like to thank the Geography and Sustainability Department, Sunrise Salem, SSU Earth Days for co-sponsoring the event. And I'm delighted to welcome today's guest speaker, Professor Mijin of Occidental College in Los Angeles. So Mijin's joining us from California today. Professor Cha's research and teaching interests are in the area of climate justice and environmental justice, two of the topics of today's seminar. She also works on labor movements and the intersection of labor and climate justice. Her writing has appeared in several international national outlets, including The Guardian, Scientific American, HuffPost, and The Hill. Professor Cha is also a fellow at Cornell University's Worker Institute, where she works on the Labor Leading on Climate initiative. Professor Cha is on the board of the Center on Race, Poverty, and Environment, and is also a member of the Californian Bar. So she's a trained lawyer as well. She recently testified at the US Congress House Committee on Oversight and Reform on the fossil fuel industry's role in climate disinformation, where she was asked questions by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. One second here, my notes. Okay, and today's seminar will focus on issues around EJ and climate justice. For context, the environmental justice movement challenges the unfair distribution of toxic, hazardous, and dangerous waste facilities, toxic industries, pesticide use, which are disproportionately located in low-income communities of color. Climate change disproportionately impacts people of color and lower-income communities, and these marginalized communities are hardest hit by fossil fuel extraction, as well as neglected by the state in the wake of the crisis. So when President Biden took office in January 2021, it was widely expected that he would reverse Trump-era policies and take steps to address climate change, racial justice, and rising inequality. And today we're going to hear about some of the successes, failures and challenges of the Biden administration's EJ and climate justice actions. So without further ado, I'd like to hand proceedings over to Professor Cha, who will speak for around 35 minutes or so, and this will be followed by Q&A. If anyone in the audience has a question, please pop it into the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. Okay, that's all from me. I'll pass it over now.
Well, thank you so much, Noel, and thank you so much for having me here today. I'm excited for this conversation. I have to apologize in advance because I have a PowerPoint, but I have extremely limited PowerPoint skills. So you would think all these years of using PowerPoint, I would get better, and I have not. So I have just a brief PowerPoint that will kind of walk us through where we are in terms of climate and environmental justice policies in the Biden administration. And thank you again for having me. And what it was helpful, I think, when we're talking through these things is that there is a distinction between climate and climate justice, which I think will become clear through through these slides. So we're really thinking about not just what we need to address the climate crisis, but what are the equity implications, and are we actually supporting people who are disproportionately impacted by the climate crisis? Okay, so it's good. All right. So again, just a very brief overview. We're going to talk about executive action on climate. The executive orders that the Biden administration has issued, and the Build Back Better and Inflation Reduction Act. Those are the two big pieces of legislation that have come out so far during the Biden administration. So just a brief some background that legislative action on climate and environmental justice has stalled for several administrations. This doesn't mean, of course, that there hasn't been any action on climate and environmental justice policies, but through legislation, so the things that go through Congress. Part of this is because we've had such a split partisan issue, so Democratic presidents, Republican legislature, but A lot of it is because legislation is very difficult to pass, but there has been very limited legislative action on climate and environmental justice until this administration. So part of the reason why we focus on legislation is that it is just it's more meaningful and permanent than executive action. As Noel mentioned, executive action can then be overturned by following subsequent administrations, where legislation is, of course, much more difficult, not impossible, but more difficult to overturn. So as a result, executive order and executive action are the most commonly used tools. Executive orders, for those of you that are not as familiar, are edicts that come from the executive office, the president. They are de facto legislation in that they act in ways that are similar to legislation, except that the scope of executive order is limited. So the president can issue things that affect agencies because agencies are within the control of the executive. But for instance, he couldn't ban the use of fossil fuels across the country, despite our hopes. So executive order and executive action are the most commonly used tools, but they are limited in the scope of what they can accomplish. And then the lead up to 2020, a lot of folks saw as a climate election. Interestingly, even though climate was not really discussed in any of the debates, you had candidates like Jay Inslee who were seen as who really promoted climate change as their top issue. And then, in response, a lot of the candidates for office had climate plans. This is distinct from previous elections where, you obviously always expect a plan for economy, a plan for healthcare, a plan for foreign relations sometimes, but they had very specific climate plans, which was a break from previous elections. So a brief history of executive action and orders. So executive action and orders is something that has been used very commonly in administrations. President Bush used it really to consolidate power through, appointing people who were very close to him and who were in his close circle. So then you could consolidate and concentrate power in the executive branch. President Obama focused more on executive action because he had such partisan opposition to his administration. So executive action and executive order, the point being that it is not something that has been, created by the Biden administration. It's something that is used throughout several administrations, really starting since the Nixon administration, sometimes to consolidate power in the executive branch, and sometimes because there's just too much partisan gridlock that prevents any kind of policy movement. So Biden and the Obama administration and the Bush administration used a combination of executive orders, administrative actions, and agencies. So if we think about the ways that you can create change and create policy, right? Who leads administrations? Who leads agencies? What kind of agencies exist? So for instance, in President Bush's administration, he created the Department of Homeland Security. It did not exist before September 11th. So thinking about the ways that you can use executive action in administrative capacity to expand and consolidate power. So at the beginning of the Biden administration, we see that there is a continuation of this tradition. We'll talk the next slide about the executive orders, but when he came into office, one of the first things he did was issue an executive order on climate. But there is a break now that we see with some of the legislation that has passed. So while the Biden administration began using executive orders and actions similar to previous administrations, we do actually see how successful they are and whether they are climate justice and environmental justice legislation still remains to be seen. But in a break from, I would say, way back to, let's say, the Clinton administration, a Democratic administration being able to pass legislation to advance climate has not happened for many presidencies. President Bush was actually able to pass legislation called on energy that actually expanded fracking, but for a Democratic administration to be able to pass legislation that addresses climate and environment, it has been quite some time. So in the lead up, so now we're talking, we talk about the ways that executive action is used. As we lead up to the Biden administration, again, it was considered to be the climate election. But the question is that, was it a climate justice election? And I raise this because, while Jay Inslee is seen as a climate champion, and in many ways he really is, he is a very market-based climate he really believes in the market as a way to solve the climate crisis. So a lot about tax credits, a lot about incentivizing private action to expand renewable energy, for instance, less about what is the government's role as an actor in both the climate and addressing the climate crisis and as a market actor. When we think about climate justice, right, the other reason why we think about it is that what are the impact of the policies? And you hear a lot about, you have to take the good with the bad. And we'll talk about this a little bit more when we talk about the Inflation Reduction Act. But the question becomes, who is defining good and who is absorbing the bad, right? So when we think about, was it a climate justice election? Do you hear discussions about we can unleash the power of the market to advance climate, to advance renewable energy? And do you hear less about, ending the use of fossil fuels, right? You hear a lot about the positive parts about how we can expand renewable energy. And then you hear a little bit about kind of demonization of oil and gas companies, especially now, given record profits. And you hear much less about we have to end the use of fossil fuels, right? You could hear some of it, but when there's not some kind of edict of we will end the use of fossil fuels by 2040. So when we talk, which is what we need to do for climate justice goals, right? The burning and extraction of fossil fuels causes climate injustice. So you cannot actually have climate justice while you continue to burn fossil fuels. So when we think about, is it a climate justice election? Is it a climate justice policy, right? Those are the distinctions that start to come to the front. Having said that, so, if we look at, for instance, President Biden's pre-election kind of when they released their candidates' policy platforms, you see some Green New Deal language. And what I mean by Green New Deal language is that, if we think about the difference between the Green New Deal and, say, a technocratic solution to climate crisis, is that, things like whole of government, right? So when we're thinking about the scale of effort that we need to undergo to address the climate crisis, are we thinking about small, kind of tweaks around the edges? Or are we thinking about a New Deal style project, which really revamped and kind of really rethought how we think about government and the role of government, but also the scale, right? And then also the thing to think about with Green New Deal language is, are we thinking about social and economic considerations as climate considerations, right? So the other thing that I think is important about the Green New Deal is that it really integrated how people's material conditions are climate considerations. So if you're thinking about eliminating coal miners' jobs, right, considering the state of our safety net in the US, what does that actually mean for those people and their material conditions? So as a result, things like healthcare expansion, things like unemployment insurance, those become climate provisions because they help advance the climate agenda, right, by reducing opposition from people who will face a threat to their material conditions. So you see some of that in the Biden campaign platforms, not just Biden, but other Democratic candidates, as they talk about, health impacts of climate change, right? The negative consequence, the disproportionate burden that Black and Brown communities have had to face. I think of that as more, and the approach then is whole of government, right? Substantial investment in renewable energy build out. Those kind of things are much different than unleashing the forces of market capital to address the climate crisis. And the last point is that even though the Democratic Party is so closely associated with unions and labor, if you listen to what they say, very few actually say union, right? They say we care about workers, which is good and we should. But Biden is one of the first presidents that really talks about unions, right? People should have not just good jobs, but they should have union jobs. We can talk in Q&A about why that's important. And of course, unions, being a union in and of itself is not the end goal, but the point of being in a union is that it helps democratize the workplace, right? And union wages are higher than non-union wages. So the point of emphasizing the union aspect, right, is that it moves away from this generic language of we are creating good jobs to, if you are in a union, right, you have the ability to strike, like many of the academic workers in the University of California system, right? It's one step beyond just we should be creating good jobs. Okay, so what has the Biden administration actually done? So we are we are now 2 years in, less than 2 years in. So, you know, on the one hand, what can we expect? But on the other hand, if we look at actually kind of what is on paper, it's not too bad. So one of the first things that President Biden did actually was he had issued an executive order 14008 tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad. And he did it in January of 2021. So as soon as he kind of got into office. And some important points about the executive order. So it does take a whole of government approach. So the idea now is that we are no longer siloing climate and environmental issues into the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, but we're integrating climate into all of the agencies. So it's not just you have your agency in directive and then you tack climate on the ends. But if we need, you know, what does it look like if we integrate climate considerations into every agency's mandate? The second point being, of course, that if we're going to address the climate crisis, we have to have a whole of government approach because there is no aspect of our society or an economy that won't be impacted by the climate crisis. So you can't have, for instance, the Department of Transportation having kind of working in its own silo and not taking into consideration climate, right? You can't have Department of Energy doing, so thinking about, we need all of these government agencies to both integrate climate into their mandate and also mobilize to have a whole of government solution for the climate crisis. And, you know, as I say this, of course, the impact of the extent to what they actually do integrate into their mandate is still to be seen. But the point being, of course, that there's at least this language that there needs to be a whole of government approach to the climate crisis. As Noel mentioned, one of the things that the Biden administration did was reverse executive action that the Trump administration had done. So recommitting to the Paris agreements and to the Kigali Amendment, which both the Trump administration had withdrawn from. The third point that I think is important is the federal government as market actor. So often people don't really think of public sector as a market actor, but of course they have tremendous purchasing power. So as part of the executive order, there's a requirement for zero emission government fleets. So if you think about not just the cars and trucks and buses that are part of federal agencies, but the U.S. Postal Service, for instance, right, they have a huge fleet. So thinking of the federal government as a market actor, so really using the purchasing power of the public sector to drive changes in the markets. Justice 40 and revisiting of Executive Order 12898. So in the Clinton administration, the first executive order on environmental justice was issued, Executive Order 12898. And there again was to try to integrate environmental justice considerations into agencies. It created also the National Environmental Justice Advisory Committee. One of the big critiques of the executive order, however, is that at the very end, it says that there is no private right of action, which means that people like you and I cannot sue an agency for not integrating environmental justice considerations. So in some sense, it really took out any of the power of the executive order. But it does require things like equity considerations in agency action. So the executive order 14008 kind of looked to revisit and kind of reestablish some of these things. So, again, they revamped the National Environmental Justice Advisory Committee, and they issued this proclamation called Justice 40. And Justice 40 is something, again, we'll talk about in the next couple of slides, but it basically says that 40% of all climate spending must be targeted to disadvantaged communities. It is it has the potential to be a massive tool for climate equity. It's based on some states. California has done it, and New York and some New Jersey are also starting to do it. But basically, the idea is that you map out where disadvantaged communities are in the state, or here in this case, it would be in the nation, and then you target resources to those communities. So 40% of all climate spending will be targeted towards disadvantaged communities. There are a couple of things that need to be resolved, which is what is climate spending, right? Is it direct spending? Is it to the benefit of disadvantaged communities? Is it directly spending in those communities? So what do we mean by spending? I think actually the actual language is benefits. So what do we actually mean by benefits? And then what do we mean by disadvantaged, right? So the way that this has been addressed at the state level is mapping tools using demographic and economic data. But what do we really mean by disadvantaged communities? And the last point about the executive order is that it established a working group on coal and power communities and economic revitalization. So this is part of what we consider to be this idea of just transition. So how do we support fossil fuel communities and workers as they transition away from from a fossil fuel economy? It's interesting, I think, a point to note here that it's really focused on coal communities, which I think you see a lot of the just transition efforts in the US especially are focused on coal. I think because coal is already in transition, right, due to natural gas, not to any climate policy. So it's also coal is geographically limited in terms of where coal is mined. So just something to keep in mind about when we think about just transition, like what the efforts are happening, that a lot of it is really still based in the coal industry and less on oil and gas. Okay. So then the second aspect of executive orders and actions are kind of what kind of administrative personnel and executive agency action has happened. So I have opinions about these people, but John Kerry, who was Secretary of State, was appointed as Special Envoy, which is a cabinet level position specifically targeted to climate action. This is the first time that there has been a cabinet level position targeting climate change and climate action. So what was seen by a lot of people as a big deal. I think what limits the potential of the position is the person who is holding the position, but we can talk about that in Q&A. He also appointed Gina McCarthy to the White House National Climate Advisory. Gina McCarthy is a long-term environmental and climate person. She was President Obama's head of EPA. She also headed the National Resource Defense Council. So a lot of people saw that as like a marker of the seriousness of the commitment to climate action. I do believe, though, that she is either leaving or has left the administration. Michael Regan, who comes out of North Carolina, was appointed to be the head of the Environmental Protection Agency. He has done some good things on environmental justice in the state. So again, it was seen as an indication of a commitment to environmental justice by the administration. There are some EJ advocates who say that, who have a pretty solid critique of his time in North Carolina, but I think that in terms of who you're going to get into office, at least he has some commitment to EJ and as actually knows what it is, which of course is a giant improvement of the people who had held the office 4 years prior. Deb Haaland was the first Native American cabinet official who was appointed to the Department of Interior. This is an extremely important position for climate because Interior deals with all federal land. So you have a tremendous opportunity to, for instance, ban oil and gas extraction on federal land. There is a pretty significant push for equity in the Department of Energy, including appointing Shalonda Baker, who is a longtime energy justice and energy and environmental justice. She's an academic, but she has a legal background. Her initial appointment actually was blocked by Senator Mike Lee from Utah, but I think they have found another position for her so she can continue her work there. And as I mentioned earlier, the revitalization of the Environmental Justice Advisory Committee. Okay, so then if we turn to the legislation part, there's just so many acronyms that it's like, is it Build Back Better? Is it the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act? Like, what is it? So the Build Back Better agenda, which was President Biden's big initiative, the interesting part of it was that there was a human infrastructure component and a physical infrastructure component, and the level of spending that was kind of the price tags that were attached to it were much bigger than we have seen in previous administrations. So $2 trillion. It's not enough, but it is much more than that has been proposed previously. So when we think about human infrastructure, I think it's an interesting way to think about it because it really does talk about how we need to build systems into place to support humans. Like we kind of think about, we need systems and institutions in place to build roads and bridges, but we don't really think about it in terms of what we need for people. So the human infrastructure components are things like paid family leave, healthcare expansion, family supports, minimum wage increases, the things that we really need to have to help build human infrastructure. In the Build Back Better agenda, there's also substantial investments in climate policies, especially in clean energy deployments. And then, of course, the physical infrastructure, the upgrading of our infrastructure and repair, and which includes public transportation. So at the time the Build Back Better agenda was introduced, of course, there was tremendous opposition from Republicans. And then there was a tactical decision that was made to split it into the human infrastructure part and the physical infrastructure part, assuming that because the physical infrastructure part could attract Republican support, hence it became the bipartisan infrastructure bill. And I think it's important here to note that part of the reason why Republicans are attracted to infrastructure, the way infrastructure is done in the US is because it often comes with a lot of money for highway expansion. So again, not ideal for climate. So, but they decided to split it between physical infrastructure and human infrastructure. And then what ended up passing is the Invest in America Act. So it was a third of the size of the Build Back Better agenda. It had no human infrastructure, so was really only focusing on physical infrastructure. And then there were limited climate provisions. So there was some money for public transit. There was some money for electric vehicles, tax credits. There was actually some good infrastructure money that has been a long-term priority for environmental justice advocates, which is water and lead pipe to fix water and lead pollution in drinking water. But there was also a substantial investment in carbon capture and sequestration. So $7 billion directly for carbon capture and sequestration, an additional $5 billion for carbon storage. And this is a big split between the climate movement and the climate justice movement. Carbon capture and sequestration, one is has a yet to be proven technology. So the idea is that you could still burn carbon dioxide, but you would just capture those carbon emissions and store them somewhere. So I think some pretty big questions still are lingering, like where do you store it? How do you ensure that something that is a gas will not leak, for instance? And then the other things have yet to be proven. So underground storage is not proven. I think there is an idea to then take the carbon dioxide and make it into solidify it. It's still unproven. But the big point is that the issue with carbon capture and sequestration and these technologies is that they allow for the continued use of fossil fuels, right? So the idea is that you can still burn fossil fuels, you just capture the emissions and then you just do something with them so they don't go into the air. This is a huge issue for environmental justice and climate justice advocates because there are lots of negative consequences that come from burning fossil fuels that don't have to do with carbon dioxide, for instance, like all of the air pollution, all of the pollution to the water, to the pollution to the land. So there are reasons besides climate that we should stop using fossil fuels, but also because it's just another giveaway to the fossil fuel industry, right? So you are subsidizing some kind of technology that will help a very profitable industry continue to do what they're doing that is causing this crisis that we are all now facing. So carbon CCS and other what they call negative emissions technologies are something that is a big divide between the climate and climate justice movement. So after the Invest Act, there was a lot of push for getting to the Human Infrastructure Act, right? So again, the idea was that we split it between physical infrastructure and human infrastructure. They passed this bipartisan Infrastructure Act, and then it became, what about the human infrastructure part? So then in September, they passed the Inflation Reduction Act. So it is a $700 billion commitment. Again, this is much larger than what we have seen before. But if we remember, the original Build Back Better Act was looking at something like $2 trillion, so substantially less than before. There is some human infrastructure like healthcare expansion and a prescription drug cap. I think it's always important when we talk about these things, though, that the drug cap is for seniors, right? It's for people who use Medicare. But not for people who, for instance, use Medicaid, right, which is for low-income folks. So we see a lot of things that are happening that are, Medicare can then become, can negotiate prices. All of these things are good, but I think it raises the question that why aren't these drug benefits also then extended to Medicaid, which is also a government-run health program. Some of the estimates for the Inflation Reduction Act, because of the clean energy investments, are that it will reduce emissions 40% by 2030. This is obviously good. It should be 80%, but 40% is better than not doing anything, maybe. And then $47.5 billion specifically for environmental justice priorities, which would some things like reduce air pollution at ports, reduce pollution in schools, drinking water, more drinking water investments, Superfund cleanup sites, etc., energy infrastructure and rural areas. Here, I think it's important to note that the official estimates are that there are $60 billion to environmental justice communities, but an analysis by the Just Solutions Collective looked at it, and they took out all the things that would be kind of good for people generally. So things that are targeted towards air pollution reduction generally are not counted as environmental justice spending because they are not targeted towards environmental justice communities. So when you look at things that are targeted towards disadvantaged communities, that $60 billion comes down to $47.5 billion. And then there is a large amount of spending for solar, wind, and offshore wind production tax credits, EV tax credits, other low carbon priorities, such as energy efficiency, so to reduce home heating. So there is substantial funding in the bill to help incentivize a lot of these low carbon and zero carbon activities. But it's not all good, right? And the bad parts, I think, depending on who you talk to, when I mentioned that it would reduce 40% emissions by 2030, I think it depends on how bad the bad parts are, right? The most being that there's, again, more support for CCS and yet another yet to be proven negative emissions technology. So remember, $7 billion, $12 billion total in the INVEST Act, and yet more investment for CCS in the Inflation Reduction Act. There's this very strange and gross provision that for every lease that goes to solar and wind production on federal land, one must also go to oil and gas. So there's a 1-for-1 requirement. I'm pretty sure Joe Manchin put that in himself, but when you have these 1-for-1 lease requirements, then the benefit of renewable energy production starts to become less and less because you are continuing, if not expanding, oil and gas extraction. This was supposed to say no operations or capital support for public transportation. Again, there was some money in the INVEST Act, but this was really an opportunity for having a massive inflection into public transportation that would help, really move us away from the car culture that we have. Those EV tax credits are good in that they incentivize the shift from combustion engines to electric engines, but really what we need to be doing is shifting from private vehicle use to public transportation. And the support for EJ communities falls short of the Justice 40 requirement. Remember, 40% of all spending is supposed to go to disadvantaged communities. My back of the envelope calculations is that of the over $300 billion that were supposed to be targeted towards clean energy, 40% of that is somewhere in the $100 billions of dollars range, not the 47.5 billion that is currently being allocated. And then permitting reform. So another obsession of Joe Manchin and others is that they think that the argument is that clean energy deployment is being bottlenecked because of existing environmental legislation and the requirements for permitting. So what they want to do is streamline and fast track these developments. This is, again, a huge point of contention between the climate and environment movement and the climate and environmental justice movements, because one, you should look at who's supporting permitting reform. It is a lot of fossil fuel interests, because if you streamline these permitting processes, you can actually also deploy fossil fuel extraction and use much more quickly too, right? And one of the points of contention is the ability for communities to have public participation. It slows down the system because it slows down the process because you let people talk about their concerns. That has helped a lot of environmental justice communities speak out about bad projects. So this permitting reform, I think, has unfortunately had some kind of messaging around it as it being a pro-climate provision, but I really see it as very nefarious and something that really needs to be stopped. And then because of these tensions, really created deepened the divide between climate and climate justice. So the bill has no mandatory fossil fuel reductions. And this, again, ties into something that I talked about at the beginning about this, the good outweighs the bad. Who is defining the good and who is absorbing the bad? So permitting reform and continuing of fossil fuel extraction, that just continues our sacrifice zones, right? The areas that bear the most pollution, that are largely people of color, low-income communities, right? Their air, their water, their land is completely poisoned, such that there's an area of Louisiana that what used to be called Cancer Alley and is now called Death Alley because it is the hub of petrochemical production in the United States. And the people that live there, right, absorb so much pollution that they have now started calling it Death Alley. So when you say that, we have to accept some bad fossil fuel extraction and use for the good, we really have to think about who is the good benefiting and who are we asking to absorb the bad. And the last point is that it's all carrots, which means that it's all tax incentive, tax subsidies, everything to help the market participants, private companies do the right thing, and less about mandatory restrictions. So again, there's no elimination of fossil fuel subsidies, for instance. There is no requirement of reduction of fossil fuel extraction and use. So, when we think of the things that we need to do to address the climate crisis, some of that, the carrot part, so expanding renewable energy production is in the IRA, but the parts that are the harder we will actually need the mandatory drawdown of fossil fuel infrastructure and use, that is not there. And so just to wrap up, so to get to Q&A, what comes next? So now the fight moves to the states because the administration of the IRA will really dictate how successful it is. A lot of these things are then, money and things that are trickled down to the state level. So what will happen at the state level is a really big, important fight. We will likely have split governance, so Republican-controlled House, Democratic-controlled Senate. I don't expect any kind of meaningful legislation to come out in the next 2 years. So we can think about whether that then puts pressure back on the Biden administration to go back to using executive actions. Right now, we're in the middle of COP27, so there is at least some hope for loss and damage, which is the idea that wealthy countries should help lower-income countries both deal with the damage of climate change, but also help them implement low-carbon technology, since we are the ones that are creating the problem that the lower-income countries are bearing the brunt of. Permitting reform will continue, and this debate will continue. There is discussion, there is this kind of toxic narrative by some people who are even climate advocates like Brian Schatz of Hawaii that we promised Manchin this permitting reform for his vote, so we have to do it, and less discussion about whether we should be doing it, right? And then we can anticipate the continuing of oil and gas lease auctions. So for me, that means the fight really is at the state level, right? I think, a lot of attention and resources goes towards federal action. And I think that, there are some meaningful things that need to happen at the federal level, especially in terms of resource mobilization. The federal government is able to mobilize resources at a level that states can't. And then setting, floors so that there's minimums that states have to abide by. But if we think about where we're going to see the most meaningful action, I really think it's at the state level. So thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Okay, excellent. That was a really great breakdown of the evolution of EJ issues within the Biden administration. And one thing that I was thinking of as you were talking there, you mentioned Biden's Justice 40 initiative, which calls for 40% of benefits from both existing and future federal investments to go to marginalized communities. And to achieve this goal, the administration is developing a screening tool to identify the communities in need of investment. And you mentioned how California and other states have developed mapping and screening tools to help identify communities most in need. Could you speak a little bit more about the importance of this initiative and maybe some of its challenges and opportunities?
Sure. So, this Justice 40 initiative and the mapping tool is modeled on something that we do in California called CalEnviroScreen. So CalEnviroScreen came about because the California legislature passed legislation that said a certain amount of spending from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund had to go to disadvantaged communities. So the idea is that you have the mandate for targeted investments, and then you need to understand where the targeted investment should go. So CalEnviroScreen, it uses a series of metrics to kind of understand where disadvantaged communities are in the state, and then you can then target investment to those communities. I think some of the challenges are, again, how do you define disadvantaged? So one of the issues is that our data is limited. So if you use a census tract, for instance, what was happening in California was that there are some census tracts in the Bay Area that are extremely wealthy that are right next to very poor census tracts, right? So if you say that, that area is not suitable for targeted investment because so many wealthy people are there, it doesn't actually get down to the granularity of actually, but poor people live right next to rich people, right? And poor people are the ones that are bearing the brunt of the pollution. I think also thinking about, one challenge we had in California that is not necessarily the same challenge as the federal level is because of Prop 209. You cannot use race as an indication for any kind of spending. There are lots of metrics that you can use as a proxy for race, always income, health burdens, those kind of things that they've developed that I think are goods. But I do think you need to explicitly list race, right, because of environmental racism and the deliberate poisoning of Black and Brown communities. And then the third is that, this idea of benefits. So is it that you're doing spending directly in those communities, or is it that to the benefit of those communities? And the difference is, for instance, the reason why some of those billions were reduced from the amount that an IRA was that some people argue if you have pollution reduction overall, that benefits EJ communities because there's less pollution. That is very different than directly spending in those communities to reduce pollution or to help, advance clean energy technologies. I think those are the three big fights that you'll see. And as the mapping tool that the federal government has developed is kind of rudimentary. I think one good thing that they could learn from CalEnviroScreen is that because CalEnviroScreen layers different metrics, you actually understand cumulative burden. So how much total pollution is being imposed on these communities. As it is now, if you do like just single layer by single layer, you either just see air pollution or you just see water pollution or you just see, but if you do it cumulatively, you can understand the true pollution burden of these that is put on these communities.
Okay, that's really interesting. Another question that I'd like to ask is you mentioned just transition, and I know a lot of your work is kind of centered around the concept of just transition. But many workers across the US are skeptical of the concept of just transition, in part because deindustrialization has led to many unjust transitions. So transitions mean job losses, loss of identities, particularly in coal regions, and stranded communities. And then in climate policy circles, the concept of just transition is thrown around a lot, but there's no real uniform definition or vision of what this transition actually entails. And you recently did some fascinating work with the Labour Network for Sustainability on this topic. And it'd be great if you could share some of your findings from this project, speaking a little to the kinds of actions, policies, and visions that could lead to actually existing just transition outcomes for both, fossil fuel dependent communities and more broadly, economy-wide transitions to a low carbon economy.
Yeah, thanks for bringing up the Just Transition Listening Project. So we interviewed over 100 people across the country who had either experienced transition or were in the face of transition to kind of understand, we talk a lot about, as you mentioned in climate circles, about just transition, but what does it actually mean? And what we found was that, one, this history of unjust transition that you mentioned, that this is not, the transition away from fossil fuels was not our first transition, right? It is just the latest industrial and economic transition. But because we have been unable to support workers and communities in previous transitions, there's a lot of distrust. And it shows up in ways that I think are not necessarily what we would think of. But for instance, a lot of transition assistance focuses on training programs. And workers are very rightfully weary of training programs because often you train people, but then you don't think about what are you training them for, right? So that led us to really argue that we need to focus on job creation and ensuring place-based job creation. So we hear a lot about, yes, we will lose these jobs in the coal industry, but we're going to create millions of jobs in solar installation. Well, those skills don't necessarily transfer. And also solar installation jobs are largely being created in states that have good renewable energy policies, which are not the states that mine coal. So you can create a bunch of jobs in California, but that doesn't really help people in Kentucky. So understanding that we really need place-based job creation and economic diversification. So part of the reason why these communities and workers are so dependent upon fossil fuels is because the fossil fuel industry deliberately pushed out any other industry so they would become mono-dependent. We don't want to replace one industry with another mono-dependent industry, right? So thinking about how do we create local economic developments. And the last point that I'll say is that, what we really also found was that there are parts of the energy transition that are specific to climate, such as fuel replacement. But a lot of it is that we just don't do equitable economic development well. So, we have a dearth of good jobs. When we think about what jobs could come in to replace coal jobs, right? It's like Walmart, which is a terrible employer, right? Or a call center. So it really underscored the argument that if we make our society more just, it actually will help advance the energy transition, right? So higher minimum wage standards, making sure that people have access, that we make the conditions so that people can unionize, and ensuring that communities will have tax replacement so that they can transition away from fossil fuel use, right? And healthcare support, all of these things that will make our society more just will actually help advance the climate, will actually help advance the energy transition.
And one of my questions from my students, she wanted me to ask, how you conceptualize green jobs. So like the traditional conceptualization of green jobs, very much male dominated, hard hat focus. But this, the Green New Deal has kind of broadened this conceptualization a bit, and people like Elisa Battistoni, who writes about the, pink collar worker, etc. Maybe could you add some comments on, how the conceptualization of green jobs is changing, or is it changing within the Biden administration? I mean, I guess a lot of Green New Dealers are pushing for it to be changed, but how does that tease out within the Biden administration or other proposals?
Yeah, I think, it is still mainly dominated in the building and construction trades when we think about green jobs. But you're absolutely right that I like to say low carbon employment, because healthcare, for instance, is actually a low carbon employment, right? Like the care economy is low carbon. And those jobs are mainly dominated by, those jobs are mainly women of color, and immigrants. So when we think about the low carbon economy, also, we need to move away from thinking that solar, wind, and geothermal are the only industries, right? There are other industries that we need to ensure are good jobs, that are low carbon jobs. And then you could think about something like, something that the Labor Leading on Climate Initiative and other organizations have talked about are zero emission schools. So then you have a zero emission project where we're thinking about bus drivers and we're thinking about teachers, and you have a school that is powered by solar and wind, but you also have electric vehicles, school buses. You also have, better insulation, better ventilation. So all of that can be under the package of climate, even though it does more than just talk about solar and wind.
Yeah. And then kind of related to this kind of broadening of discussions, there's a really interesting recent study from Mark Paul, who I know you've worked with, and others, that show how the principles of neoliberal ideology to decentralize democracy, defund public investment, and deregulate the economy have hindered climate action in general within the US and further afield. The Green New Deal, on the other hand, rejects neoliberalism. It aims to revolutionize the energy and economic system while also offering these clear and direct benefits to the massive working class, which you talked about as well. Could you offer some thoughts on the movement for a Green New Deal within the US and how it has changed how we frame climate and energy policy? And, are there any success stories, or what are the key kind of challenges going forward?
I think one metric of its success is that we still talk about it, right? It wasn't something that kind of went away. And even though there was a lot of ridicule, right? I believe it was Speaker Pelosi who called it the Green New Dream or whatever, but people still talk about the Green New Deal and advancing a Green New Deal. And I think it's a helpful framework for understanding how social, economic, and climate considerations are intertwined. So, even the fact I think we could argue that there's a physical infrastructure and human infrastructure, right? Like we're beginning to think about why people's material considerations and why people's well-being are important considerations for climate. And so the Green New Deal, what I think is helpful is that it gives that kind of, it gives a counterbalance to neoliberalism, right? So it's not just about emissions reductions. It's not just about what is the perfect amount of tax credit. One argument that I think I agree with is that the IRA is also a change from the past in that it is a massive amount of spending, right? $700 billion is, in contrast, the big stimulus that Obama passed in 2008, I think was $785 billion. And that was when the economy was totally in distress, right? So $700 billion for kind of proactive spending, I think is a shift in the role that we see the federal government playing. And I think that's the other point about the Green New Deal, right, is that it's no longer focused only on how can the market help solve this problem, but what is the public sector's role and how can we leverage the public sector to do much more ambitious, much more equitable actions. And then in terms of successes, I think, you see a number of local and state unions that have endorsed a Green New Deal. I think that's very good. There hasn't been at least that I know of, like a GND policy that has passed, but the fact that people still talk about it, they still kind of think in that way. I think you're seeing glimpses of it. Illinois just passed this very ambitious climate bill that had a provision that if you have a renewable energy installation over a certain size, it has to be, there has to be labor standards. I think those kind of things, targeted outreach, targeted employment, I think those things kind of get in that realm of there are social and economic considerations that should be part of climate policy.
Okay. So going on through the questions, there's a few kind of speaking to broader issues around climate justice. So, how we conceptualize climate justice beyond the US borders, the role of the Biden administration in actually tackling global climate justice, particularly around discussions around loss and damage. The US has historically been a block to global climate action. Maybe if you could just offer some comments on the kind of broader global climate justice challenge and what the administration is or isn't doing.
I mean, certainly climate justice is a global issue, and climate change is a global issue, right? And so I think about, when we think about, and you've written about this, Noel, about just transition, right? Like, is it really a just transition if the solar panels that we're using are made by people who are in enslaved conditions, right? Or rely on lithium that is mined in a really extractive and exploitative way, right? So I think that is what the climate justice kind of more justice-oriented nature of climate policy focuses on, rightfully so, right? Because I think there are people who think that climate change is caused by greenhouse gas emissions. So as soon as we reduce emissions, we'll address the problem. And there are people who think that climate change is the natural product of extractive and exploitative systems. So until you address exploitative and extractive systems, you will continue to have a climate crisis. And so to that point, right, if we have the global north full of solar panels that are made at the expense of the global south, that is not a just energy transition, nor will it actually get us to where we need to for our climate considerations. To be honest, I don't think the Biden administration will do anything to advance climate justice globally. We have been a terrible actor in general in international climate negotiations, right? The US has always stopped more progressive, more ambitious policy. Which is why I said that even though John Kerry is in the cabinet, like the idea that there's a cabinet position is good, the person who's occupying the position, I think, limits the ability for us to really advance climate. He is very much a market-based person. So to that extent, we can assume that the things that he thinks will solve the crisis are in that vein. So I don't have a lot of hope, to be honest, about global climate justice. I have maybe a tad more hope that there could be some equity provisions passed domestically, but of course, since climate justice is a global issue, what does that really do to advance global climate justice?
Yeah, and there are some interesting discussions happening outside of COP, like the non-fossil fuel proliferation treaty, discussions around what a just transition means for fossil fuel rich third world countries, etc. And I guess we all, the COP is the most important meeting happening in the world right now, but it's also very much kind of background music. A lot of stuff has to happen outside of this meeting as well. But of course, loss and damage is a critical issue, but we kind of know where that discussion is going to end up within the COP, unfortunately. I have a question here about gentrification and green gentrification. So it's from Alexis Netfinger. Can you speak a little bit about combating green gentrification? Are there good examples of initiatives that are working to bridge silos between folks working in climate and housing, examples of folks working to stop displacement in low-income communities of color when improvements come from polluted cleanup sites, green infrastructure, and investments in renewable technologies? Any thoughts on that? So how we can combat green infrastructure?
I would point to the work of Daniel Aldana-Cohen, who I know you also know, who does a lot about the intersection of climate and housing, and how do we have green, affordable housing that both provides housing for people who are housing insecure, but also is good to green housing. I feel like the green gentrification question, this is another part of the transition, right? So if we are creating these conditions that only rich people have solar panels, only rich people live in low carbon areas, right? It's not really a just transition. So I think, one issue is that we need to just build more housing, and it should be green housing that is healthy and affordable. Two, I think this actually goes back to the permitting reform discussion, in that if you remove these processes by which low-income communities can participate, you will just accelerate green gentrification, right? So, as part of a lot of these permitting processes, communities can come and speak about the impact that these projects will have. If you remove that component, right, you remove the ability for communities to have that voice. So I actually see that, ensuring that those provisions are in place are really fundamental to stopping things like green gentrification.
Yeah. And we're getting close to the end. So maybe just one question on the kind of state level action, and particularly around the Green New Deal. So, within Boston, it's pretty exciting at the moment. We have a new mayor, Michelle Wu, who had a really, transformative Green New Deal proposal. In LA, there's discussions as well around, a Green New Deal for the city, and it's played an important part within the mayor race there. Any kind of insights on the kind of city level Green New Deal movements, or just general state level action for climate justice?
I mean, I think Michelle Wu is really exciting and shows like how you can make pretty meaningful change at the local level. I think an interesting comparison then, of course, is the LA Green New Deal, which was supported by Eric Garcetti, who is not Michelle Wu. So I think that he is also very much like, we just need a green tech incubator. But the good thing about these initiatives is, for instance, the LA Green New Deal then led the way to provide more support for an ordinance that then phased out oil and gas drilling in Los Angeles County, which is huge, right? So people often see California as a big green state, but actually we are the 5th largest producer of oil and gas. And so as part of the phase out of oil and gas drilling in Los Angeles County, they created a Los Angeles County Just Transition Task Force, which I was a part of. And so I think, the more that these local wins and these local initiatives really do build up momentum, because if you stop drilling in oil in LA County, you could maybe then see where are other places that you could stop drilling, and then you stop, right, the extraction and use of fossil fuels. And then that builds up to the state level. So this Illinois bill that I mentioned, they have really good targets for renewable energy production, but they also, have a big workforce development component to ensure that those jobs are good jobs, right? You can make big impacts at the state level. And then if you think about the momentum, so New York also has one, California, so now it's New York, Illinois, California, I think Massachusetts also, Rhode Island has a climate jobs plan, and then Maine also has one. Then there are, Green New Deal initiatives at like in local cities in Vermont and Colorado. So these things really do start to add up. And I think, Michelle Wu is another great example of like, because you can use, with less resources, you can make a big change, right? If we use resources well and we elect the right people, you can actually make substantial change at these local and state levels that then accumulate to be pretty substantial efforts.
And that kind of ties back to the previous question on gentrification. So one of the, key parts of Michelle Wu's proposal was to, explore rent control in Boston. Boston is now, I think, the second highest or most expensive city to live in terms of rent. So, rent control, things that can actually improve the material conditions of workers is a really critical part for these types of Green New Deal proposals. And again, then tying them into the global climate justice movement as much as we can is also a critical part. So we just hit 3 p.m. So in the interest of keeping things on time, I'd like to extend my thanks again to Professor Cha for coming here today. Thanks for all of you for tuning in. Thanks for all the questions. And we look forward to continuing this series over the coming few months, where we bring in national and international experts on climate and energy policies. So without further ado, we'll end the proceedings, and we'd like to encourage everyone to still keep working hard with global climate movements. These federal elections are really important, but it's really from the bottom up that will push our politicians to make the big changes that are needed. Okay, thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.